Well, we've looked at the fundamental theorem of gradients, but what about divergence and curl, which correspond to vector fields? Now, there's a very, very intriguing relationship between the divergence of a vector field and what is called the flux, which means to flow. Now, the flow doesn't necessarily have to be the flow of a fluid. It could also be the flow of electric field. So it's just a generic notation, but there is a very, very fascinating relation between flux divergence and between the curl of a vector field and what is called the circulation. And perhaps when we do this sort of derivation, you'll see that circulation is something you've encountered before in your studies, and it's related to what's called the work done by a force, for instance. That's one example. So in this video, let's try and explore this idea a little further. Now, imagine, so we're going to restrict our discussion for now to two-dimensional flows, just to make the derivation and the ideas a little simpler. But there is, towards the end of this series, we're also going to talk about how you can generalize this idea to three dimensions. So let's say we have, and I'll point you to a video. We showed an experiment with fluid flows. Right? So we have a two-dimensional plane, and we make some fluid, let's say water flow past an obstacle, and we saw that you could generate a lot of interesting patterns. For instance, you could see the divergence, you could see the curl, and you can also see other interesting patterns. So imagine we have a similar setup, and in that fluid flow, I'm going to draw some kind of a curve, right? Now, this curve could be an abstract curve, or it could be a real thread that you can introduce in the flow. And let's say you have fluid which is flowing like this. Now, notice that I've made an arrow along this curve. And what this arrow indicates is that if I'm going to traverse this curve, I'm going to traverse it in this particular direction, right? You could choose any direction how you want to traverse the curve. And if you recall some of the discussion on the fundamental theorem of gradients, we talked about how in space, let's say I want to go from point A to point B, there are a multitude, or rather an infinite number of paths that you can take. And as I go from point A to point B, there is a sequence of directions which you can take, which will take you from your initial point to a final point. And this sequence of directions could be represented by tiny vector arrows. So imagine we have a similar setup. We have this path, and you can traverse this path in this direction, like the arrows that I'm showing here. And let's say there is some fluid just flowing across this path. And I'm going to make this idea a little more specific, what I mean by a fluid flowing across this path. Now, if you're moving, let's say, maybe you can use another color. And let's say you focus your attention on this tiny segment of the path right here, right? Now, if this is the arrow that we've made, then along this particular segment, the tangent to the curve is perhaps pointing in this direction, right? So this is a tangent, which means tangent lies along the path. So the tangent keeps changing directions. And as you traverse the path, you can make a tangent line approximately at each point on the path, right? I can choose a convention that, let's say, the normal to the curve would be always pointing to our right. So let's say you imagine yourself standing here and you're walking along this path, then this is your right hand, right? And so our normals would point in this direction. So that's just setting the tone for the notation. So I'm just going to draw this diagram again and just zoom in into one particular segment of this. So maybe the tangent is like this, right? That's the direction of the tangent. And then you'll draw a normal to the curve in this manner. So maybe I'll use this notation n hat for the unit normal vector to the curve. And we can use t hat for the unit tangent vector to the curve. Now imagine that this was the path and there is some fluid flowing on the plane. And maybe as the fluid flows across this particular segment of the path, it can be represented by a velocity vector. And let's say that velocity vector points in this direction, right? Now this velocity vector, I can take, now notice that the tangent and the normal are orthogonal to each other. And if I have a two-dimensional vector field, I can decompose it. I can take its component along these two perpendicular directions and write this vector field in the following form. So let's say this is the velocity field. I can write this velocity field in the form that I can take the dot product of this velocity field. I can take the projection of this along the normal, which will be this, right? So that's one part of the velocity vector, which points along the normal to the curve. Plus, I can take a projection of the velocity field along the tangent to the curve. And that will give me the component v dot t along the tangent to the curve, right? So this is just taking the projection of the velocity vector along two orthogonal directions and writing the velocity vector in terms of the components along these two orthogonal directions, right? So I can take any arbitrary vector field. Now, again, just to reiterate, this need not necessarily be just the velocity field of a fluid flow. It could also be the electric field. If you're interested in electrodynamics, it could be the magnetic field or any vector field which you care about, right? So we have this abstract path. We've taken the projection along the tangent and normal. And now as you move along this path, notice that the normal vector, the tangent vector keeps changing the directions. So accordingly, when you have a and so does the velocity field. So essentially what we're saying is that at each point, as you move along this path, you can take the projection of the velocity field along the normal and the tangent, which are locally defined at different points along the path. Okay. Now with this sort of notation in mind, we can define what is called the flux of the velocity field or flux of the vector field across this path. And essentially, the flux is that component of the vector which crosses or which flows across the path. So if I have this path, right, maybe I should draw it a little cleaner. So if I have this path and say this is the direction of the tangent and that's the vector field you're interested in, you can take one of its projection along the tangent, which will be this, another projection along the normal. So if this were, let's say, a fluid, and you ask yourself the question, will there be any fluid which will flow away from this path if I take its projection along the tangent to the curve? In other words, if this is the velocity vector field, and if I take its projection along the tangent to the curve, is this leading to a flow across this particular path? And the answer is no. The only part of the velocity field or any arbitrary vector field which flows across this path, which will be given by the normal, whereas the tangential one is just following along with the path. So if I go to some other point, for instance here, again, maybe the velocity field looks like this. I can again take its projection along the normal and the tangent. The tangential part of the vector will just follow along the path, whereas it's just the normal component which flows, which takes the fluid. If this were a fluid, it's just a normal component will take the fluid across from here to here, right? So just remember this particular concept. In the next part of the video, I'm going to extend this idea and not just consider an open path like the one we've considered, but we're also going to look at a closed path and ask ourselves the question, how much of the fluid or how much of the vector field is actually crossing that particular closed path? And from there, we're going to figure out the relation between what is the flux, which is the flow, the divergence, and if I take not the normal component but the tangential components of the vector or the fluid, we're going to establish a relation between the curl of that vector field and what is called the circulation along that path. So hope to catch you soon. Thanks for watching.